At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI garbage. What's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it that way. I'm Daniel Pierce, and I'm going to be your narrator. Now, let's begin.
This was the fourth winter since the Narek fleet had imposed its siege on Valar, cutting the planet off from the wider galaxy. The Valarians had never possessed much on their barren homeworld, but after joining the Galactic Council, their population had grown with new hope. Now, under siege, that hope had curdled into despair. Friends turned against friends, neighbors stole from one another, and families abandoned the young, the old, and the weak. The dream that some benevolent species might descend from the stars to rescue them had withered and died sometime around the second winter. Away from the turmoil of the cities, Azy had just returned to her family's dwelling with a meager bundle of white roots she had managed to gather in the forests. She sat grinding them carefully into a paste for soup, making sure the pieces were small enough for her elderly father to eat, since his aging stomach had grown far more delicate in recent months. The motion of the pestle against the mortar had become almost meditative, a small ritual that kept her mind from wandering too far into dangerous territory. But as she waited for the soup to cook, Azy couldn't help but catch her reflection in the tarnished mirror hanging across from the kitchen counter. Black hair fell in waves past her shoulders, though it had lost some of its former luster. Her purple skin, the same shade as the sand that gave her world its name in the old tongue, seemed somehow duller now, like a flower deprived of sunlight for too long. Her fingers unconsciously traced the contours of her long, pointed ears, the features that had once earned her a particular nickname from a certain someone during those brief, brilliant years before the siege.
My purple elf.
The voice echoed in her memory, warm and full of wonder at the similarities between her species and the mythical creatures from his homeworld stories. She had traveled to space then, working as a nurse in the joint fleet of the Galactic Council. Those had been days of discovery, of learning the medical practices of a dozen different species, of late-night conversations in the medical bay about the mysteries of the universe and the peculiarities of various physiologies. And there had been him, with his strange human humor and his ability to make her laugh, even after the most grueling shifts. Azy studied her reflection more critically now. The lack of proper nutrition had carved new hollows beneath her cheekbones, had stolen some of the vibrancy from her violet eyes. She wondered, with a pang she immediately tried to suppress, if that someone would still call her beautiful now. Would he still trace the curve of her ears with that gentle expression? Would he still insist that purple was his favorite color, said with that particular smile that made it clear he wasn't talking about the color at all? But those thoughts lasted only a few minutes before practical reality reasserted itself. The soup had begun to bubble properly now, the white roots breaking down into something that might, with enough imagination, be considered nourishing. She turned off the stove immediately. Every moment of energy usage was precious, carefully rationed and monitored. The power cells they had left wouldn't last forever, and who knew when, if ever, new supplies would come. She ladled a generous portion of the soup into a bowl, making sure to capture as much of the thicker paste from the bottom as possible. Her father needed every bit of sustenance she could provide. She placed the bowl on a tray, added a spoon, one of the few remaining pieces of their old dinnerware that hadn't been traded away for more essential supplies, and a small cup of water. Then, steadying herself, she made her way to her father's room. The door creaked as she pushed it open, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over these long months. The old Valerian was awake, as she expected, propped up against several warm pillows and staring out the window at the gray sky that had become their constant companion. The siege ships were too high to see with the naked eye, but their presence pressed down on the planet, turning even the brightest days dim. Beside his bed, the small broadcast device droned on with its daily litany of barely changing news. The siege continued. The government teetered on the verge of collapse, had been teetering for so long now that AZ wondered if it had already fallen and they simply hadn't been told. There had been no reply to their latest request for help from the Galactic Council. The same words, rearranged slightly, delivered in the same neutral tone by the same exhausted-sounding newsreader who had probably been stuck in the broadcast station since the siege began.
"I've brought dinner,"
AZ announced, reaching over to turn off the sound device. The sudden silence felt both heavy and relieving, like setting down a burden you'd carried so long you'd forgotten its weight. Her father turned to face her, his movement slow in the way of those who had learned that sudden motions cost energy they couldn't spare. His green eyes, so different from her violet ones, inherited from her mother's side of the family, regarded the bowl of soup with little enthusiasm. Still, he said nothing as she set the tray across his lap, adjusting it so he could reach it comfortably. He picked up the spoon with thin fingers that trembled slightly, whether from age or weakness she couldn't tell, and began to eat. The soup was plain, offering very little nutrition despite her best efforts, but he consumed it dutifully, one small spoonful at a time. AZ settled into the chair beside his bed, the one her mother had once occupied during the long evenings when they would sit together, talking about nothing and everything while the stars wheeled overhead. She expected this to be another silent meal, one of hundreds they'd shared since her mother's passing in the second winter of the siege. Her father would eat, she would wait, and then he would return to his broadcast while she cleaned up and tried to plan tomorrow's foraging expedition. It had become their routine, comfortable in its predictability, if nothing else. But suddenly, her father broke the silence. "You shouldn't have returned." The words lingered in the air between them, unexpected and sharp. AZ blinked, wondering if she'd misheard.
"I'm sorry,"
she said, her voice uncertain. Her father set down the spoon, the soup only half finished, and turned those green eyes on her with an intensity she hadn't seen in months. "You shouldn't have returned," he repeated, each word deliberate and clear. "When the tensions with the Narek began, you should have stayed with your fleet. You should have left your mother and me on this planet and lived your life out there." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, animated by something that might have been anger or might have been grief. "The old die and the young live. That is the way of nature, AZ. You violated that order by coming back." The words stung more than she'd expected, and AZ felt her own anger rising in response.
"I know you blame yourself for being stuck here when the siege started," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "But it was my decision to come back. My decision, Father, and I regret nothing."
Her father made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a cough.
"You don't admit that you regret it,"
he corrected, his tongue grumpy but somehow fond.
"That's different from not regretting. You always was too stubborn for your own good. took after me too much in that regard." He shook his head slowly. "Would have been better if you'd been more like your mother. She knew when to bend, when to let go." "Maybe you're right," Acey said, forcing a lightness into her tone that she didn't feel. "And now your stubborn daughter is going to make sure her equally stubborn father eats his dinner, whether he wants it or not." Before he could protest, she scooped up a generous spoonful of soup and brought it to his lips. He accepted, though he nearly choked on the unexpected volume, glaring at her with watering eyes as he swallowed. The moment he had recovered, though, something in his expression softened. A smile played at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine one she had seen from him in weeks. "Do you miss him?" he asked quietly, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he wasn't asking about some abstract him. Acey felt her chest tighten. She forced herself to maintain a neutral expression, pretending she didn't know exactly who her father was talking about. They had never discussed certain aspects of her time away from the planet. She had been careful about that, keeping her personal life separate from her family obligations, maintaining the boundaries that seemed appropriate. Her father's smile widened slightly. "I was trying to find the old pictures this morning," he said, his tone almost conversational now. "Your mother's pictures from when she was young. Thought it might, well, doesn't matter what I thought. But I stumbled across some of your personal notes instead. The ones you kept in that blue folder you thought were so well hidden." Panic flashed through Acey's mind like a warning siren. What had she written in those notes? What details had she committed to paper in moments of weakness or longing? She was too old for this reaction, she knew. She was a grown woman, had been for years, but something about having her father know such intimate details of her life made her feel like a child caught in mischief. "I might have read through them," her father continued, clearly enjoying her discomfort now. "Found quite a bit about the human." "Father, Acey began, her words tumbling over themselves in her haste to explain, to minimize, to pretend that everything had always been proper and professional, and "I'm happy you found someone," he said simply, cutting through her fumbling explanations with those 5 words. Acey stared at him, genuinely speechless. This was not the reaction she had expected. Her father had always held strong opinions about tradition, about proper Valerian marriages arranged between suitable families. He had spoken often before she had left for the fleet about the importance of maintaining their customs even as their world opened to the wider galaxy. She remembered the arguments they had had when she had announced her intention to leave, his fears that she would forget who she was among the stars. Had the siege changed him so much? 4 winters of watching their world slowly starve, of seeing traditions crumble in the face of desperate survival. Perhaps it had shifted his perspective on what truly mattered. Before she could stop herself, her mouth was moving faster than her thoughts, words spilling out like water from a broken dam. "His name was Mark," she heard herself saying. "Is Mark, I suppose humans are long-lived, though not as long as us," she heard herself saying. "Is Mark, I suppose, humans are long-lived, though not as long as us. Is an officer in the Earth Fleet contingent. We worked together for 2 years, and he..." She paused, swallowing hard, and continued. "You don't need to blame yourself for my return, Father. Even before the siege, I'd made a mistake. Mark had invited me to follow him to Earth. Interspecies relationships are legal there." Her father had set aside the soup entirely now, listening with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she forced herself to continue. "He asked me to go with him, and I hesitated. I told him I needed time to think, that I had obligations here, that I wasn't sure if I could leave everything behind. But really, I was afraid." She laughed bitterly. I broke his heart with my hesitation. I could see it in his eyes when I asked for more time. He knew I was saying no without actually saying it. He left for Earth without me, and 3 months later, the Narek arrived.
She hadn't realized she was crying until she felt the warm droplets falling onto her father's blanket, dark spots spreading across the faded fabric. Her father said nothing, politely pretending not to notice her tears, giving her the space to compose herself. It was an old Valerian courtesy, one of the few traditions that still held even in these desperate times. When the tears finally stopped, her father spoke again, his voice gentle.
"You'll survive this siege. You are young,"
he said with a certainty she didn't feel.
"and when you do, maybe you'll still have a chance."
Azy laughed, the sound hollow and disbelieving.
"It's been 7 years, Father. 7 years since I saw him. He must have moved on by now. Humans don't live as long as we do. 7 years is a significant portion of their lives. He probably married, maybe has children. He might have forgotten me entirely."
Father actually laughed at that, a real laugh that seemed to surprise them both.
You need to have a bit more faith in yourself, daughter. You inherited your mother's beauty, the kind that isn't easily forgotten. "But he's human,"
Azy protested.
"Their sense of beauty is different."
"He didn't forget you," her father interrupted, his tone firm and certain. He offered no explanation for this certainty, no justification for his confidence. He simply stated it as a fact, then picked up his spoon and returned to his soup. Neither of them spoke after that. The silence that settled between them was different from before, not heavy with unspoken words, but somehow lighter, as if a burden had been shared and thus halved. When her father finished his meal, he reached for the broadcast device, turning it back onto its endless cycle of non-news. Azy collected the tray and stood to leave, but something in her chest felt different. She couldn't quite name the emotion. It existed somewhere in the strange borderland between happiness and sadness, hope and resignation. Back in her room, she found herself drawn to the box she kept beneath her bed, the one that contained the remnants of her life among the stars. She pulled it out carefully, setting it on her small desk and lifting the lid with hands that trembled slightly. Inside were photographs printed on actual paper, a luxury even then, but Mark had insisted, saying digital images could be lost or corrupted, but physical photos endured. There was one of the entire medical team standing in front of the newly commissioned hospital ship Mercy, another of her first successful interspecies surgery, a bedside. There were handwritten notes, some in her careful script, others in Mark's sprawling handwriting that seemed to ignore every convention of proper letter formation. There were small gifts too, a pressed flower from Earth that he had somehow kept preserved through months in space, its blue petals still vivid despite the years, a small crystal from the caves of Andoria that glowed faintly in the dark, which he had acquired during a shore leave they'd spent together, a datapad containing downloaded human literature he had thought she'd enjoy, stories about elves and magic that he had said reminded him of her. But it was the small device at the bottom of the box that drew her attention now. It was bulky by current standards, almost primitive looking, with a screen that seemed impossibly small compared to modern communication devices. Mark had given it to her on their last night together, before she had made her terrible mistake of hesitation. "It uses quantum entanglement," he had explained, though she had understood the science better than he did. "Collapsed twin particles that maintain their connection regardless of distance. No matter where we are in the galaxy, these two devices will always be able to find each other." He'd been trying to be romantic, she knew, even as he had mangled the technical explanations. "So, you'll always be able to reach me, and I'll always be able to reach you. Now she held the device in her hands, feeling its weight. Heavier than modern communicators, solid in a way that suggested permanence. Her mind said with almost total certainty that Mark had likely discarded his matching device years ago. Why would he keep it? 7 years of silence, 7 years of her choosing not to reach out, choosing her world over him. He would have moved on, found someone else, someone who didn't hesitate when offered love. There was no rational reason for him to have kept a reminder of rejection. But her hands moved against the certainty of her mind. She found herself pressing the activation sequence, watching as the earth blue screen flickered to life. A connection logo appeared, a spiral of 2 dots orbiting each other, sometimes close, sometimes far, but always bound by invisible forces. It rotated endlessly, searching for its twin across the vastness of space. She was already preparing for the disappointment, already formulating the thoughts that would help her accept that he had moved on, that this was for the best, that she shouldn't have expected anything different when the screen resolved into an image, and her breath caught in her throat. A human face appeared, blurry with sleep, pillow creases on one cheek. His hair was messier than she remembered, sticking up at odd angles, and there were new white strands in his beard that hadn't been there before. But it was unmistakably Mark, and despite everything, the years, the siege, the hunger and fear and desperation of her current life, she felt her heart rate accelerate at the sight of him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She could see the surprise in his eyes gradually giving way to something else, something that made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name.
Easy,
she finally managed, then immediately wanted to cringe at stating her own name.
It's me.
I can see that, he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered, warm and slightly rough from sleep. They stared at each other through the screen, the impossible distance between them somehow both infinite and non-existent. The silence stretched, growing awkward. She scrambled for something to say, something normal and casual that wouldn't reveal the hurricane of emotion spinning through her chest.
How's life been treating you?
He blinked, seemed to gather himself, then launched into what she recognized as his nervous talking pattern.
Oh, the usual. Got promoted a few times. They made me captain after the Benzite incident. Then 2 more promotions at last year. The Mercy got decommissioned, but they gave me another position. We've been doing mostly diplomatic missions lately. Nothing too exciting. Trade negotiations, border disputes, that sort of thing.
He paused, seemed to realize he was rambling.
And you?
I've been taking care of my father,
she said, matching his vague tone.
He's gotten older, needs more help than he used to. The countryside is quiet, peaceful.
She didn't mention the siege, the hunger, the slow collapse of everything around them.
It's good to be home.
The conversation continued in this vein for several more exchanges, neither of them saying anything real, neither acknowledging the years of silence or the weight of unfinished business between them. Frustration built in Azy's chest, making her want to scream or cry or simply end the call and pretend it had never happened. Then she had what she thought was a brilliant idea.
Can I see your hands?
She asked suddenly, interrupting his explanation of new medical protocols the Earth fleet had implemented. Mark stopped mid-sentence, then smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and made the corners crinkle in a way she had once traced with her fingertips.
So much time has passed,
he said, laughing softly,
but I still read you like an open book.
He shook his head in amusement.
Interspecies relationships aren't supposed to be this easy, There should be mysterious cultural barriers, incomprehensible motivations.
Her frustration spiked.
What exactly can you read about me?
Instead of answering directly, he held up his left hand to the camera, fingers spread wide.
See? No ring.
Azy felt the color drain from her face, her purple skin going pale lavender. How could he read her so easily when the opposite wasn't true at all? She had no idea what he was thinking, what he wanted, why he answered her call after all this time. The unfairness of it made her angry.
If you can read me so well, then why haven't you asked me that same question?
She demanded. Mark's expression shifted, and he touched his head in that nervous gesture she remembered, looking away from the camera. The silence that returned was different now, charged with something that made her skin prickle with anxiety.
I haven't asked,
he finally said, his voice quiet.
because I'm afraid of the answer.
Her heart was beating so fast now she was sure he must be able to hear it through the connection.
I stayed with my parents,
she said, the words coming out in a rush.
For the past years, I've been here, taking care of them. My planet is... It's hardly a place for romance right now. You have nothing to worry about.
His eyes went wide, and he leaned forward closer to the camera.
Really?
She nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched as expressions flashed across his face, too quickly to interpret. Several seconds passed in silence, then he spoke again, his words tumbling over each other in their haste.
I know it's too soon to ask this. I know 7 years is a long time, and things change, and people change, and I've got no right to assume anything, but...
He stopped, took a breath, and asked,
could you ever see us together again?
The words she wanted to say stuck in her throat. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. When she finally spoke, it came out as a whisper.
No.
His expression immediately darkened, and she hurried to explain.
Mark, there's something I haven't told you. My planet, we're under siege. The Narek fleet has had us blockaded for 4 years. We're cut off from everything, slowly starving. The government is failing. I don't...
Her voice broke.
I don't know if I'll survive this. I can't ask you to wait for something that might never happen.
To her complete bewilderment, her words seemed to make him happy rather than sad. A smile spread across his face, growing wider with each passing second.
Hypothetically,
he said, leaning even closer to the camera.
Let's suppose the siege didn't exist. In that world, could you see us together?
The tears came then, unstoppable.
Yes,
she sobbed, the word torn from somewhere deep in her chest.
Seeing us together is all I ever dream about. Every night, every moment, I don't keep my mind in check. You're there. It's been 7 years. I still wake up reaching for you. I'm a fool. I made the worst mistake of my life when I hesitated. Yes, in a world where it's possible, all I want is to be with you.
His smile now stretched from ear to ear, boyish and delighted in a way that made him look years younger.
Hold on,
he said suddenly, as he heard the sounds of him jumping out of bed, things clattering in the background.
I'm coming to see you, in person, right now.
Mark, what are you...
Just wait for me, he said, and the connection cut off. A night of little sleep had passed, leaving Azy feeling disconnected from her own body, moving through the morning routine like a puppet with tangled strings. She had tried to convince herself that the conversation with Mark had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by malnutrition and stress. But the communication device still showed the call log, the timestamp staring back at her with undeniable reality. She burned the morning porridge, something she hadn't done in years. Her hand shook as she measured out her father's medicine, nearly dropping the precious pills. She forgot to close the door properly when she went to check on the dwindling fuel reserves, letting in the cold morning air they couldn't afford to reheat. Her mind was too focused on the conversation, replaying every word, every expression that had crossed Mark's face. What had he meant? He was coming to see her. It was impossible. The siege was absolute. Nothing got in or out of Valar's space. The Narek fleet was massive, their blockade impenetrable. Even if he tried, he would only get himself killed, and the thought of that made her chest constrict with panic. She was heading outside to forage for more roots, hoping the familiar task would settle her spiraling thoughts, when she noticed something odd. The ground beneath her feet was vibrating, a subtle tremor that made the small stones on the path dance. All the puddles from the morning's brief rain shower were disturbed, concentric ripples spreading across their surfaces in perfect synchronization. An earthquake, but Valar was geologically stable, hadn't had significant seismic activity in centuries. She looked around, seeing other Valarians emerging from their dwellings with similar expressions of confusion. The vibration was growing stronger, accompanied by a sound, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the sky itself. Daisy looked up and her breath froze in her lungs. Ships, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, descending through the atmosphere in perfect formation. They were massive, each one large enough to cast its own shadow on the ground below. And together they turned the morning light into twilight. The siege had been a weight pressing down on them for 4 years, invisible but ever present. This was different. This was the sky itself falling. Her first thought was that the Narek had finally grown tired of waiting, tired of the slow starvation tactics. They were going to attack directly, in the siege with fire and violence instead of patient suffocation. She found herself oddly calm at the prospect. At least it would be quick. Around her, other Valerians were reaching the same conclusion. She saw parents pulling children close, elderly couples holding hands, people she had known all her life, preparing for the end with a dignity that made her proud of her species, even in that final moment. But then someone screamed, not in fear, but in something that sounded impossibly like joy.
The siege!
A voice shouted from somewhere to the left.
The siege is broken! Those aren't Narek ships!
Another voice joined in, younger, more excited.
It's Earth! Earth's fleet has broken through!
The calm acceptance of death transformed instantly into chaotic celebration. People were crying, embracing, falling to their knees in relief or disbelief. But Daisy remained frozen, staring up at the darkened sky. Those ships couldn't all be human. It was impossible. Earth's fleet was substantial, yes, but this was an armada. This was the kind of force that entire stellar nations would struggle to assemble. She stood there for long minutes, her mind simply refusing to process what she was seeing. The ships continued their descent, controlled and purposeful, taking up positions across the planet's sky. She could make out details now, the distinctive hull designs that were unmistakably human, the blue and white markings of Earth's fleet. The possibility that her conversation with Mark had somehow caused this was so absurd that it didn't even occur to her as a real thought. One human, even a captain, couldn't mobilize this kind of force, couldn't break a siege that held for 4 years, couldn't darken the sky with enough firepower to make the Narek fleet simply leave. But then she saw it. A smaller ship, a shuttle, descending separately from the massive vessels above. It was moving fast, too fast for a normal landing approach, and it was heading directly for her area. The pilot was either supremely skilled or supremely reckless, possibly both. The shuttle's landing struts hadn't even fully deployed when it touched down in the field, not 50 meters from where she stood. The engines were still cycling down, heat shimmer making the air around them dance when the main hatch burst open. A figure emerged, jumping down before the ramp had even extended, and broke into a run toward her. His hair was exactly as messy as it had been on the call, sticking up in all directions as if he had come straight from bed. He was wearing what looked like a hastily thrown-on uniform, the jacket unbuttoned, one boot not properly fastened. Then Mark was there, right in front of her, real and solid, and breathing hard from his sprint, and Azy's mind simply stopped working entirely.
Did you, she managed, did you come here directly after leaving bed during our call?
He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, running a hand through his already chaotic hair.
Something like that,
he admitted, and his voice was shy in a way she'd never heard before. They stood there for a moment, just staring at each other, the impossible made real. Then, as if some spell had broken, they were both talking at once, words tumbling over each other in a rush of questions and explanations.
I had no idea you were...
They stopped, laughed, nervous, slightly hysterical laughter, and Mark gestured for her to go first.
I need to know,
Azy said, trying to organize the hurricane of questions in her mind.
After I said no to Earth, what happened?
Mark's expression shifted, becoming something between rueful and embarrassed.
I became a bit obsessed with work, he admitted. Threw myself into it completely. If I wasn't on duty, I was studying for advancement terms. If I wasn't studying, I was volunteering for extra shifts. Classic human coping mechanism. If you work hard enough, you don't have time to think about what you've lost.
7 years of that?
No, 6.5,
he corrected.
I made Admiral 6 months ago, youngest in Earth fleet history. Though that wasn't exactly my goal. I just needed to keep busy.
He paused, then added quietly,
I never knew you'd returned to Varlar. I thought you were out there, just on a different ship, different assignments. If I'd known about the siege, about what was happening here...
You'd have what?
Azy asked.
Brought Earth's entire fleet to break a blockade. Started a war with the Narek.
Mark looked genuinely confused.
Started a war? No, I just asked for passage. Told them I needed to go to Varlar for personal reasons and requested they move their blockade to allow my shuttle through.
Azy stared at him.
You asked?
Well, I may have been somewhat insistent.
He shifted uncomfortably.
And I may have brought the fleet with me as a show of force to emphasize how important this personal matter was. But I made it very clear I just wanted to see you. To see someone on the planet, a personal visit.
Mark,
Azy said slowly.
The Narek have lifted the siege completely. Their entire fleet is withdrawing from our system.
His eyes widened.
They are? But I just wanted... I only asked for passage for my shuttle.
Despite everything, the hunger, the fear, the 4 years of slowly watching her world die, Azy found herself laughing. Real, genuine laughter that came from somewhere deep in the chest and seemed to wash away years of accumulated grief.
You didn't explain to them, did you? She managed between gasps. You showed up with humanity's entire fleet and demanded passage to see... How did you phrase it to them?
Mark's cheeks colored slightly.
I may have said I needed to reach my purple elf immediately, and that I was nervous.
Purple elf?
Azy repeated, and the old nickname made her heart do something complicated and wonderful in her chest.
You told the Narek fleet that you needed to reach your purple elf, and they must have thought...
I don't really care what they thought,
Mark said.
If they retreated, then it was just a fortunate misunderstanding.
A fortunate misunderstanding,
Easy repeated, a puzzled expression crossing her face. They were standing closer now, though she couldn't remember either of them moving. She could see new lines around his eyes, a few white hairs in his beard where the video call had revealed, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. He was real, solid, here in a way that 7 years of memories couldn't match.
I'm sorry
She said suddenly, the words busting out.
for hesitating.
I'm sorry, too. I should have contacted you sooner,
He replied, reaching out to take her hands.
You came back to me
She whispered.
after 7 years. You came back.
You called,
He replied simply.
and I'll always answer.
The kiss that followed was 7 years overdue, but worth every second of waiting. It was gentle and desperate, sweet and passionate, a hello and an apology and a promise all at once. Around them, the world was celebrating the end of the siege, but for Azy and Mark, there was only this moment. This connection that had survived time and distance and impossibility itself. Later, much later, the story would be recorded in both human and galactic history as the most successful case of accidental assistance ever documented. Academic papers would be written about the diplomatic implications of Purple Elf Initiative, as it came to be known in official documents. Military strategists would analyze how a single human's romantic determination had accomplished what 4 years of diplomatic negotiations had failed to achieve. The Narek would tell their own version, speaking in awed tones of the humans who would mobilize an entire fleet for matters of the heart.